Bend It Like Beckham director Gurinder Chadha faced some criticism when her most recent film, Viceroy's House, was released in March. It told the story of Indian partition, set in and around the palace of the final Viceroy, Lord Mountbatten. Partly, Chadha has said, to ensure this chapter of history was remembered in Britain. But the film's version of that historical divide was controversial. In this paper, the writer, Fatima Bhutto, called it a servile pantomime of partition, while Ian Jack wrote that the film takes a breathtaking liberty with the historical record. Chadha was defensive, of course, and issued a firm denial of any perceived anti-Muslim bias, stating her sadness that a film about reconciliation should be so willfully misrepresented as anti-Muslim or anti-Pakistan. The Hindi-dubbed version, Partition 1947, meanwhile, has just been banned in Pakistan. It is against this backdrop that India's Partition: The Forgotten Story BBC Two emerges, and one suspects that this documentary about Indian independence and the creation of Pakistan has been made carefully, if not as a rebuttal to further criticism, then at least with that in mind. Chadha's take on the story here is personal and, therefore, she points out, only one version of it. What really happened 70 years ago, she asks at the beginning, where she is careful to point out that the answer will depend on who is telling the story. At school, she recalls, it was attributed to the inability of religious groups to get along, while her mother tells her that's not how she remembers it at all. Chadha is probably right when she says the story of partition has been largely forgotten in Britain. I began to realize how little I know about Britain's colonial past. This is shameful ignorance to a large extent, but also, I think, indicative of the lack of teaching on the British Empire in schools. The historian Dr. Shashi Tharoor, also featured here, has previously called the absence of education in Britain's colonial past historical amnesia. Chadha's approach to this documentary is twofold. First, she adopts a kind of personable, who do you think you are style, beginning by telling of and talking to relatives caught up in the violence of 1947. She speaks to her Sikh mother and her surviving aunts, one aunt starved to death during this time, about fleeing their home, in the region that would become Pakistan, when partition was announced. It is an emotional conversation for all involved. We never thought, says one, her voice cracking. Her mother explains that she has never been back to the place where she grew up, and, 70 years later, the pain is still palpable and raw. The other tactic is to come at the subject as if she knows nothing about it, instead throwing it open to various experts and historians who are more qualified to dissect and unravel an unimaginably complex time in history. In some ways, it is effective, and allows her to present this as a beginner's guide that covers all the basics for relative newcomers, affecting a kind of intimacy as the viewer finds out the facts at the same time as she does. At times, though, Chadha's naivety is a stretch. She made a movie that was set during this era, so this clearly can't be such a voyage of discovery. Who was going to win out, she asks, at one point, as if the mystery is yet to be solved. Yet the interviews with witnesses to the Kolkata riots are devastating, as are the stories of religiously motivated violence in the immediate aftermath of the new borders being announced. A man watching his family being murdered with spears, a woman who tells of other women with their breasts sliced off. Again, as if burned by the reaction to Viceroy's House, there is a clear emphasis that violence took part on all sides, from all faiths, that millions suffered, that up to 2 million people died. Unsurprisingly, the British do not come out of this story well. Perhaps there are contemporary lessons to be drawn from rushing to enact hugely disruptive legislation without fully considering the consequences, though the point is not laboured here. As I said, this period of history is shamefully unfamiliar to me. There may be assertions within this film that prove controversial with some historians. It is a short and highly personal investigation that cannot begin to cover the necessary ground to make convincing arguments for how the partition of India came to be. I don't think Chadha would claim that it could. However, in a country that is lacking in comprehensive and substantial education on its colonial past, it may be a good place to begin.